Greetings, Metzeran. We're now going to make the pattern for the kaftan, and because all of my measurements and my divide by 4 to match my 4-inch grid that I'm putting on the graph paper, ensuring that it all fits on one page for you, I've divided those by 4 already, but rather than flipping the paper back and forth, I've just transferred those measurements onto the diagram for the kaftan pattern. And again, I'm going to draw a half of this pattern, just getting all of my pieces and then annotating where I need to cut to. This back section is a solid piece. The front would be that same solid piece cut halfway down the center. And then we have these additional front extensions. This is a few of the things that make this characteristic of 16th century Ottoman Turkish clothing is the hip bump that we see on the side gores, this front extension, which is asymmetrical. So on the left-hand side, it's going to be at least 1 inch wide at the neckline and come down the entire front. And on the right-hand side, it's starting at mid-chest or waist and continuing down to the hem. Then I've also attempted to draw that in here so that it makes sense, but it's written in the description as well. The buttons themselves get sewn on that right-hand side, so they will be on the very edge of our main fabric, and then they will follow the line of that front extension. So they stay right on the edge. This is actually as if the front extension was folded open. They stay right on the edge following that front extension, and the button loops actually get sewn where that seam line is to the left front extension. So this is also as if it's folded open. And I folded them open in the drawing so that they could both fit on there, and you could see how this varied between the two. So this is a key factor that distinguishes the 16th century clothing. Also, if there's a short sleeve, we generally see a scoop out of the front of the short sleeve, and the facings will go inside of the front openings, around the hem, in the neckline, and in the short sleeve it would show or be present where that scoop is. For the purposes of our meter, for our uniform standards, we're using a long sleeve. It can either be tapered or it can be straight, so you could make this a fully straight sleeve. That long sleeve would be on the under kaftan, the base layer, and then on the outer kaftan, you can opt to have either the short sleeve with the scoop or no sleeves. Those are both options that we see in the paintings that we have of groups where we can visually identify meter or musicians within the janissary corps. So those are the two options that we're using in order to have our layering and have it match those images. Let's get busy drawing. So I'm starting with B, which was my measurement of width of a body panel. And I'm going to do this actually with this half so that we can draw in these details or separate out these pieces. So I'm going to start up here near the center of the page and go 3 to either side. And then I also want to come down for my A measurement, and that's going to be 14.25 squares. 2, 4, 6, 8, 14.25. Okay, so this is giving me a nice straight line where my top edge will be. Utilizing the graph paper and having a straight line of the graph paper down the center, which is helpful as well. Okay, this is coming down to 0.25. It's a little tricky at the angle with the camera in the way, trying to get those perfectly straight lines. This one's a little bit off, but I'll shore that up when I actually draw it out at full size on my true grid. Okay, so this creates just this front body panel. For the back neck, just like we did for the gomlek, I generally would go 1 inch back and about 3 inches wide. So I'm going to draw that here just because I'm remembering that that's going to be the back. And then the front neck, I would generally come at least 2 or maybe 3 inches down and get a nice curve there. That's giving me the neckline. Also helps so that you can then see and I will indicate that this gets cut open down the center front. Because I'm drawing the pattern pieces, I'm going to kind of adjust as I go. So I want to do these hip bump extensions. These could be cut in one with the body, and for the purposes of our metair, we have determined that for the better, we have good, better, best standard, and for the better standard, you could cut all in one with sleeves, all in one with hip bumps. Obviously you have to do these front extensions as separate pieces. And then for the best standard, we'd be cutting all the pieces to match historical loom width of the fabric and ensuring that that matches up. So that's just one differentiation on how you can make these a little faster if you're trying to get it done at the better standard. Okay, so I'm seeing there's got to be a mistake here with these numbers because this is off by 1. So let me see. A is 14.25 and F 13.25. Oh, and that's because here it was coming all the way up to the extension. Okay, so in order to convert that to the waist down, I'm going to take, I actually have an outseam measurement of 41. Right, so that was the difference, is this was armpit to floor for the gomlek, but I actually want waist or hip down for the kaftan. So that's going to be +1, so outseam is 41, so I'm going to do 42. Divide that by 4. So this should actually be 10.5. So in order to draw that piece here, I had a quarter, I had 1 inch here, so that would be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and up a quarter. And then on the pattern handout, I actually have that this can extend to the width of the fabric. If you were cutting it in 1, you'll go to the width of your fabric. Otherwise, I would probably do about equivalent to half of the body panel. That's a nice size, or maybe a little longer. But half for my body panel here. I'm just going to go a little over to 0.75. And then if I was drawing this on the true grid, I might use a French curve to get a nice curve there, but I'm just freehanding it here for the purposes of the tutorial. And I actually want to keep the curve up top and sort of straighten this line. I want the curve just there for the hip bump. And then I'm going to put a marker here as a reminder to self that I'm going to install a pocket. One of the really cool things with these kaftans is that pockets are period, and they can be installed down, they can be installed closer up the hip bump, or they could be installed just ahead of the hip bump. Like if we did a cut line here, we also see those on extant garments. So anywhere out here is where you can also put in a pocket. What I found with the hip bumps is it makes it so that you can sit all the way down to the floor without needing to lift the skirts of the caftan. You can sit down neatly and it doesn't bunch or grab or tangle. So that is, I believe, potentially the purpose of this hip bump, which otherwise looks kind of funny to us because it's not consistent with what we see on other types of garments of the period. Okay, so I have that pattern piece now. I need these front extensions. So for the front extensions, I'm actually going to draw one off to the side here because I know that my left front extension, I want to be at least as long as the neck. Actually, let me bring that out to this side just because that might be a little clearer for you following along. So I know that this side length is going to match from the neck down to the hem for the left side extension. And I will also swing this out. Here I would say you want to go at least 6 inches. You could go up to as wide as the half the width of the body panel. So it's optional how much overlap you want there. So I would say at least 6, at least to here, or I'm going to go up to half. And I will generally note on mine, and remember we want at least 1 inch here, but we also need the seam allowance built in. So let's come over to the 2-inch mark. I will generally note on mine that I will just maximize what I have on my fabric width with this. It might need to be a little bit narrower, but I'm going to stay within at least that 6 inches wide. Oh, sorry, 6 would actually be here. So 6 inches wide up to my body width, or half of the body, half of the front body panel. So this would be left side front, and for lack of a better term, I'm just calling these side front extensions. I don't want to call them gores because they're not being set in on both sides. It would be a gore if it was being set into fabric on both sides, but this one actually gets attached only along that straight edge seam. Okay, so that's the left side. The right side, I'd like to bring this just about mid-chest. So we'll come just about here. Again, I'm going to draw it off to the side on the right-hand side in order to keep it really clear for you on the video. Okay, again, I would like this one to have at least a couple inches. This one can taper down to nothing where it is sewn in at the attachment point, but I want to ensure that I've got a decent piece of fabric to start with. Again, I'm going to go for at least 6 inches, or I could go up to that body width. I'm just going to take it out the 3 squares, which would actually be 12 inches in the case of this piece. And this would be the right side front extension. Okay, so we have this piece, the main body panel, those 2 side extensions. Now we need a sleeve. So for the sleeve, I'm going to go ahead and draw that beneath here. And for the sleeve, I have that my sleeve head, or this would actually correspond to the largest portion around the bicep with some ease built in, is 24.75. And then the length is going to be 6.75. So since I came down that 0.75, I'm going to kind of come here and mark my center, and then go out 2, 4, 6. .75, and then I had a minimum of 2.75 for the wrist for the wrist opening, but I'm actually going to make this one just a slighter taper because I know the person I'm making this pattern for might not want exactly a straight sleeve, but would like a taper that could still be rolled up if necessary. So if you know you have somebody who likes to do messy work and would occasionally need to roll up their sleeves, you might choose to give them a straight sleeve or a slightly tapered sleeve. Okay, in that case, that is the long sleeve. For the short sleeve, we would tend to bring this scoop at least just above the elbow. And in this case, I don't have that measurement. I would need to check that on the person to see just above where the elbow length is. Or I most likely will make her outer layer sleeveless so that that is matching the look overall of the janissary and matière that we can identify in period pictures. So this is essentially all of the parts. There's a few other options here I'd like to point out. These dotted lines are all period construction techniques seen on extant garments. So on rare occasion we see sometimes a little sleeve extension. It isn't necessarily always an underarm gusset. We do see underarm gusset used on gomlek, but not necessarily on kaftan. So the underarm gusset could be there, or you could actually build that into the sleeve. So what I might do is come here and say I'd like a 4-inch gusset. So I'm going to bring that down the 4 inches. But since this is only a portion of the gusset, I would actually cut it like a triangle. So I would add that onto my sleeve, making a little sleeve extension. That's one option. Another option is these side body panels. So you can see this sort of makes a gusset underneath the arm. And let's see, this would be 2.5. So you can see where this doesn't necessarily get all that long. So that could be a little side panel inserted underneath, or that could actually be curved. And these are all just based on things I've seen on period garments, both from Topkapi and from other collections. There's a couple of other collections that show us examples of kaftan turned inside out, which is really useful for seeing a lot of those inner construction details. So I hope that helps you understand some of those options that you can have in place. Again, this left side front gore, this edge is being sewn to the front edge here, and then this seam line is where our loops would go for our buttons. On this right side front extension, this straight edge is getting sewn here to the straight edge, and then the buttons would go along the straight edge, and when it comes out, they would also follow that bend and come out along the front edge. These two front extensions create the overlap on the front of the kaftan. And if you'd like to do any additional labeling, you might want to add in here that on each of these extensions, I just need to cut one. For the body panels, for this overall panel, I could cut 2. One open down center front. Or I even could cut this in one, so I could run the length of the fabric, cutting this all in one piece. It just depends on the shoulder slope. If you have somebody with sloping shoulders, you might opt to actually put a seam here in order to be able to slope the shoulder. So that just depends on the fit for the individual person. For the hip bumps, this would either be cut in one with this piece, so this could be laid out on the fabric just as is, and I could cut the hip bumps on either side. Or I would need to, so I would say cut in one, or I'm cutting 4, and those would need to be facing front back. Again, if you're just working with a solid color material, this becomes a lot easier. As long as you're staying on your grain line, you could cut these in any direction. So if you had an extra piece, you could take this piece and rotate and cut another one headed this way, just optimizing the use of your fabric. Okay, sleeve obviously is cut too. And there we go. Happy sewing. Okay, one addendum I want to put for this caftan pattern. We drew out all of the main body pieces, and you have two options when it comes to the finishing. I talked about how to put these front extensions on the body, and that facings would go around down the center fronts on these front extensions, around the hemline, in the neck, and in the sleeve if you had a short sleeve. There are two options for our Metar standard. On our under caftan, we are not requiring linings, but we are requiring facing. I will give you the caveat though that if you are not lining it, you do need to fully finish, hand finish all of the interior seams, and the facings would then require hand finishing to sew them down around the entire body. If you were wanting to fully machine sew or machine sew as much as you possibly can, then having it fully lined before doing your facings is helpful. The reason I don't generally draw out the facings is that this is actually easier to put your caftan together. You would cut all of these same pieces for your linings, but for the facings, it's easier to put the caftan together, and then I would lay it out on the fabric and follow the curve here. So if I were drawing a facing pattern, I'd be laying the actual finished caftan down, following this actual curve to the hem after I've decided exactly where I want to hem it. And that facing is going to be approximately 6 inches wide, 6 to 8 inches wide, and it's always a solid color. It's usually a contrast color to the body of the caftan, and we usually see most typically plain white cotton lining, and then the facings would be a contrast fabric of a fabric that matches the exterior. So a silk would have a silk facing, wool would have wool facing, cotton would have cotton facing. So we typically see that designation, but the facings I would draw this way, and then you're basically seaming it and folding it to the outside. If you were wanting to do as much machine sewing as possible, you could actually sew the facings onto the lining, and then you're treating that whole piece like a bag lining. So you're then sewing that edge to the outer edge and turning it all inside out via the neck in order to just need to finish the neck band. Speaking of which, I did not draw a neck band. So we also would have a neck band. Generally we want that to be at least 1 inch up to 2 inches of a standing neckband, and I'm going to draw it in line with the squares here, but I know that the neck measurement here is 14.75, so I'm going to go at least 16 inches. So for me that would be at least 4 squares. So here I'd be cutting a 4-inch by 16-inch piece and using that to create the neckband. I drew it straight on the squares here, but what I would do in preference is actually turn it on the bias and cut that piece on the bias of the fabric. But that would be the neck or stand collar. So if you're opting to bag line with the linings that have the facings attached, go ahead and you would turn that inside out through the neck, finish the neck, and then perhaps finish the sleeves at the armholes. So just depending on whether you have long sleeves, short sleeves, or no sleeves at all. Alrighty, I hope that makes more sense, and I will have more detailed videos on how I'm cutting this out and putting it together coming up soon. Happy sewing!